October is a month full of fall festivals and celebrations. As fall begins, everybody loves a good hayride, pumpkin spice, and we all hope for 7 games in the World Series. Whatever your thoughts on Columbus Day and Halloween are, both happen in October. We have days to celebrate everything from pork to vegetarians. Seriously, how did those 2 days get lumped in the same month? And then there's groups of people we recognize this month: pharmacists, dental hygienists, coaches, and breast cancer survivors. But also, since the early 1900s, the church has recognized the month of October as a time to honor another group of people: missionaries who have impacted history, countries, and cultures around the world. In October, we celebrate Missions Month. It's a celebration of the Great Commission, Christ's charge to all believers. In Matthew 28:18, Jesus says to his followers, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I will be with you always to the end of the age." Since the time that this command was given, men and women have been responding to this call, giving up their safety and their comfort to build God's kingdom on earth. When struggling to survive in a foreign country, a missionary's greatest comfort may be found in the knowledge that theirs is a life of purpose and obedience to the Great Commission. History tells of missionaries whose lives changed the face of a nation, while others have fulfilled the Great Commission closer to home in less conspicuous ways, some of them intentionally inconspicuous. In the quest to fulfill the Great Commission, many ministers have had to conceal their work in order to preserve it. Some even formulated secret operations, serving their congregation not only in word, but in covert deed. This was the case in our first story. Kjeldgaard Jensen, a Lutheran pastor from the small town of Kjeldgaard, Denmark, operated his secret mission during the Nazi occupation of 1940.
When Nazi Germany invaded Denmark and proceeded to occupy the territory, there was little the Danish government could do. The occupation was carried out so quickly, the Danish military didn't have time to respond. The Nazis wanted to use Denmark as an example of an easy and efficient occupation. The Danish government, having little to say in the matter, was forced to accept a collaboration. The elected Danish government continued functioning, but under Nazi supervision. The Danish police remained under the authority of the Danes, and as a result, the citizens were less resistant to the Nazis than in other countries, such as Norway or France. But there were still isolated attempts to resist the Nazi occupation, especially within the Danish army. Intelligence officers immediately started funneling information to the Allies. Soon after this so-called peaceful occupation of Denmark, the Nazis banned the Danish government and ordered the police to arrest its fellow citizens. The members of the government who escaped went underground and bolstered the resistance. A clandestine newspaper called Land og Folk was distributed illegally across the country, right under the nose of its occupying regime.
As time went on, insurgent groups worked secretly to oppose the Nazis. Sabotage missions were carried out by rebel groups who used weapons smuggled in by the Allies, and on some occasions, attempted assassinations of Nazi officers. As the war went on, the Nazis began planning the deportation to Nazi concentration camps of the 7,800 or so Jews in Denmark. Danish leaders would not stand for this. They encouraged their citizens to protect and hide their fellow Danes.
Within the church, Danish bishops rejected anti-Jew propaganda. They told their congregations that Jesus was a Jew, and the command of Christ to love one another also applied to the Jews. This message spread throughout the country, and the Danish citizens began to offer help to their Jewish brothers and sisters. Throughout the occupation, Danish Christians hid Jewish citizens in their homes and facilitated underground transportation to neutral Sweden. The Danes put their ingenuity to use, taking Jews in ambulances, faking injury or sickness. Even funeral processions were used as a guise to conceal the illegal ferrying. The effort was remarkably successful, but not without risk. If caught harboring a Jew, many Nazi officers were commanded to shoot the resistors on sight.
On October 3rd, 1943, Pastor Jensen read a letter from church officials encouraging Christians to help the Jews. Pastor Jensen's congregation responded heroically by sheltering over 1,300 Jews. They hid them in floors, attics, barns, and shops.
The small town of Gilleleje, Denmark, where Pastor Jensen was stationed, is just 10 miles across the Kattegat Strait from Sweden. So naturally, it became a gathering point for escaping Jews to Sweden via boat. During the operation, Jensen's church members helped purchase fuel for the local fishermen to carry the refugees the 10 miles to cross to Sweden. The fishing boats traveled late at night and at times were hindered by bad weather or German patrol boats. Some ships were swamped and sank, drowning the refugees. But the church members continued their efforts. They established connections and worked closely with the Danish resistance. Some of the church members were arrested, imprisoned, sent to concentration camps, and shot to death for assisting the Jews.
Hundreds of families were hidden and protected just long enough to get them to safety. By October 5th, 500 Jews were hiding in Gilgale, awaiting ferry to Sweden. They realized boats would be the fastest and safest way to get the Jews out of Denmark. The townspeople raised today's dollar equivalent of $150,000 to incentivize the captains of nearby boats to risk the voyage.
When the boat was at half capacity, the captain, realizing the risk of the illegal act, became frightened and pulled away. Quickly, Pastor Jensen organized smaller vessels and loaded as many Jewish people as they could on the boats.
After loading the available vessels, they still needed space for 100 people. Pastor Jensen volunteered the church to harbor the rest while the boats made their journey. Shortly after, the Gestapo got word. The church was quickly surrounded by Nazis and all but one child was arrested. A note by Pastor Jensen captures his sadness.
October 5th, 1943 was a terrible day for all of Gilgale. This was the day the German occupation forces carried out a raid looking for any Jews in the village. This was repeated during the following days, and many known and previously unknown Jews, estimated at 1,200 to 1,300, had taken refuge here, both in private houses and, unfortunately, also in the church loft and parish hall. Unluckily for us, the Gestapo and police forces stormed these premises. I, the undersigned parish priest, had been up in the loft on numerous occasions to help and give comfort in the desperate situation that had unfolded. Probably 100 Jews were taken to Horse Road Prison, from which they had since left. But for where?
Because of Denmark's courageous defiance of Hitler, 95% of its Jews survived the Holocaust. Nearly 20% of those survivors went through Pastor Jensen's church at Gilgale. Looking back at World War II and the Holocaust, it's easy to see where the church missed opportunities to stand against the Nazi regime. But then there's people like Pastor Jensen, whose story shows us the impact we could have when the church fulfills its mission in the face of fear and adversity. Growing up, stories of great ministers and missionaries inspired me to spend some time doing mission work. I decided to head to the islands of Jamaica and Panama. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jamaica and Panama? Don't people go there for vacation? Well, yeah, but people on the beach need Jesus too. After weeks of relief work, rebuilding huts, helping people, and actually being a missionary, I came home to people calling me just a vacationary. Well, at least I didn't go to Fiji like our next missionary. And believe me, John Hunt was no vacationary. When he stepped foot on the remote island in 1836, he never left.
Growing up, John Hunt's fears were fairly normal for a young boy in England during the 1800s. Dogs, gypsies, and thunder, his prayer life was centered mostly around protection against such evils. But when Hunt became a teenager, his prayer life subsided. Desperate to fit in, Hunt would take part in the normal debauchery of the youth at that time. But after a severe fever threatened his life, Hunt recommitted his life to the things of God. Motivated by utter dread, he prayed, read his Bible, and made public confessions of his faith. But like most fear-motivated endeavors, he did not find peace. Only as he learned to trust in the grace of God and the fullness of Christ's sacrifice did he let go of his deep striving for spiritual approval. Hunt preached the Word and studied his Bible with great discipline. In order to keep his commitment to his responsibilities on the farm, Hunt would study the Bible late at night. His hard work continued at the Theological Institute in London, where he developed his knowledge of the Scriptures even more.
Hunt soon met the love of his life, Hannah Summers. She was ready to take on her new life as a missionary with her husband. They had big plans. After getting married, they planned to leave their home and work as missionaries in South Africa. But to this new couple's dismay, the Wesleyan church leaders asked them to go to the islands of Fiji instead, which today would be like, heck yeah, cowabunga, here I am, Lord, send me, Fiji. But in the 1800s, this was no task for a vacationer. 200 years ago, the islands of Fiji would have been terrifying. Fiji was a land of disease, violence, and cannibals. So the newlyweds didn't see Fiji as a honeymoon destination. Even though a tough road lay ahead, to everyone's utter surprise, the couple agreed, and they sailed to Fiji in the first year of their marriage. Arriving on the islands, the Hunts were confronted with extreme contrasting elements. Fiji itself was beautiful, serene, a bit of heaven touching earth, but also filled with violence. Theft, murder, and cannibalism was rampant. Human roastings were a regular occurrence, and one man disturbingly claimed that he had eaten from 900 cooked human bodies. Yikes.
The missionaries would unfortunately be able to verify a few of these cannibalistic ceremonies. 11 dead men were eaten in front of the mission house, and shortly after, 16 women were slaughtered. The ovens for the ceremonies were so close to the missionaries' houses that the stench was unbearable. But because of the customs, if they tried to close the doors, the king of their province would become furious and would have reason to kill them. So the doors had to be left open. They encountered villagers who cut off the fingers of those caught stealing. The sick and infirm were strangled to death, and victors of village wars ate their enemies. Astonishingly, Hunt was able to master the native language quickly, so he was able to preach and spread the gospel in a timely manner. After only a few weeks of studying the native language, Hunt delivered his first sermon. After a month, he was able to give 2 or 3 sermons a week. Soon he was preaching 3 sermons on Sunday and teaching throughout the week. John also established a small medical clinic, and during spare moments, he continued to study the Fijian language. Hunt soon began translating the New Testament from Greek to Fijian, and after a very slow, grueling start, a handful of Fijians began to commit their lives to Christ.
At the request of the king of Rewa, a province on the main island of Fiji, Hunt established a mission at Somosomo. They were welcomed and allowed to reside at one of the king's huts. However, the Somosomo were slow to embrace Christianity. After 3 years in Somosomo, Hunt and his wife set sail for the nearby Viwa Island. There, they found that many Viwa natives were already practicing Christians. Hunt built on their effort and the gospel message spread. Eventually, even the Queen of Viwa accepted Christ.
Hunt invited the people to be set free from the fear and darkness of their violent practices and enjoy a new way of life with Jesus. He told them that by accepting Jesus, they would need to give up their culture of violence and death in order to accept the gift of God of eternal life. More than 100 Fijians accepted that invitation, including the queen of their island. Not long after, an enemy tribe attacked the village intent upon genocide, but the war party inexplicably fled in fear. Later, these men admitted their plan failed because they suddenly knew the missionaries' God was stronger than they were. Excitement about Jesus spread from island to island, and brutal cannibals became transformed into peaceful, devout Christians. One evening, as Fijian villagers worshipped, a band of 30 chiefs surrounded their church and threatened to kill everyone inside. The congregants said and did nothing. Finally, one of the chiefs entered the door brandishing his club, but immediately fell to the floor in a swoon. As the other warriors entered, they too collapsed until all 30 lay helpless. By morning, every warrior of that party had received Jesus. According to one report, the broken-hearted cry of "Jesu, Jesu" was heard throughout the gathering, and mats were covered in tears at the altar. Describing the event, John Hunt said, "This is a way of saving souls which lays the pride of man in the dust." We like to have souls saved in connection with the gradual use of means so that we can philosophically trace the event to its cause. But the blessed God goes out of our ordinary way, pours contempt on our philosophy, and by means we should never have thought of, accomplishes his own purpose. In addition to translating the Bible and preaching village to village, Hunt also trained up teachers, villagers, to teach the Bible. Hunt's lessons and lectures were compiled into a manual of theology and used for decades on the islands. On December 1st, 1847, John wrote to friends in England, "We can now report upwards of 3,000 who attend our ministry and that of our teachers every Lord's Day."
In the final days of John Hunt's life, the islanders pleaded to God to take 10 of their lives in exchange for his. But even on his deathbed, Hunt kept praying for his Fijian friends, wishing that he could have reached even more. He passed away at only 36 years old. Hunt's last moments on this side of heaven were recorded by a witness. They said that Hunt suddenly grew very calm, and a person in the room asked, "You see a bright prospect before you?" Hunt responded, "I see nothing but Jesus." Soon following, Hunt would breathe his last words on that day, October 4th, 1848. "I want strength to praise him abundantly. Hallelujah." I love Hunt's dedication to the Great Commission. He and his wife faced the unknown in order to fill Christ's command to go into all the world. And in the end, he received his reward. He saw the face of Jesus. Decades before, in the month of October, another missionary found himself facing the same final moments here on earth. And what was on his mind? Perhaps the very thing that drove him to weather the peaks and valleys of ministry in the Middle East: eternity.
It was October 16th, 1812, when the missionary Henry Martyn breathed his last breath in the mountains of Tokat, Turkey. His last diary entry said, "Oh, when shall time give place to eternity? When shall appear that new heaven and new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness? There shall in no wise enter in anything that defileth. None of that wickedness which has made men worse than wild beasts, none of those corruptions which add still more to the miseries of mortality shall be seen or heard of any more."
Henry Martyn was prone to a violent temper. He was described as self-centered and full of contempt. You may think that's a little harsh, but this was a description of Henry Martyn by Henry Martyn himself. Though he had glaring flaws, he also had a sense of self-awareness, and he would use this skill to continually chisel away his self-described sharp edges. He's remembered for his courage, selflessness, and his religious devotion. Even today, parts of the Anglican Communion celebrate his life with a festival on October 19th.
Henry Martyn was born February 18, 1781 in Truro, United Kingdom. Shortly after, his birth mother died. Growing up motherless, his father tried to tame him by redirecting his focus to the sciences. Martyn was a small boy and would often be bullied by the other school children. To combat this issue, Martyn employed the services of an older, bigger boy named Kjeldgaard. It was Martyn's temper that ultimately drew him closer to Christ. You see, Martyn came very close to killing a dear friend. In a fit of rage, he hurled a knife at him. Luckily, he missed. But this incident prompted his friend Kjeldgaard to urge Martyn to take some time away.
During this time of reflection, Martyn experienced a spiritual transformation. He learned of the work of missionaries in India and the American colonies. Learning about the lives of these courageous men inspired him to go to the nations himself. Through these encounters, Martyn's original plan for law school slowly shifted into a call to ministry. Accepting a position as the chaplain for the East India Company, Martyn would use the proceeds to support his family.
Henry Martyn ministered as a chaplain in India from 1800 to 1810. During that time, he translated the New Testament and the Anglican Book of Common Prayer into Hindustani. At his own expense, he established a variety of schools for the native Indian population. Often under threats of personal violence, he began to win over the hearts of the people and became a popular preacher. While in India, Martyn combated sickness every day. But he managed to translate the entire New Testament into Urdu as well as Persian. Henry Martyn was the first Protestant missionary to make significant efforts to bring the gospel to the Muslims of India. Martyn also translated the Psalms into Persian. During that time in history, Persian was understood from Calcutta to Damascus. Martyn's New Testament was the first translation into Persian since the 5th century. With his Persian translation of the New Testament complete, Martyn left India, setting out for the province of Bushire. He had with him letters from diplomat Sir John Malcolm, written to men of position there, as also at Shiraz and Isfahan. After an exhausting journey from the coast, he reached Shiraz and was soon plunged into discussion with men of all different classes. The Sufi, Muslim, Jew, Jewish Muslim, and Armenian were all anxious to test their prowess in debate with the first English priest who had visited them. Martyn was able to share the gospel there, and the people were able to hear the message of Jesus.
Martyn continued to travel all throughout the Middle East. He went to Tabriz in the country of Iran in hopes to present his New Testament translation to the Shah. Although he didn't deliver it himself, the Shah wrote him a letter.
Through the learned and unremitted exertions of the Reverend Henry Martyn, it has been translated in a style most befitting sacred books. That is, in an easy and simple diction. The whole of the New Testament is completed in a most excellent manner, a source of pleasure to our enlightened and august mind. In the midst of his ministry, Martyn was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Doctors advised that he find a place with fresh sea air to aid in his health. But instead, Martyn was headed for Persia, and the dusty air did not do him well. He eventually made his way to the mountains of Turkey. The only Christian in the mountains of Turkey, Martyn's letters and diaries reveal his physical struggles and the faith in God in which he found his strength. In one journal entry, he wrote, "I cast all my care upon him who hath already done wonders for me, and am sure that come what will, it shall be good, it shall be best. How sweet the privilege that we may lie as little children before him. I find that my wisdom is folly, and my care useless, so that I try to live on from day to day, happy in his love and care."
Finding new strength in the cool mountains, Martyn started a new project, translating the Bible into yet a third translation, this one being Arabic. During a journey to Constantinople, his fever and chills increased. With the increase in his sickness, so too his harsh mood. He was aware of his irritability and made notes in his journal scolding himself for his temper. While in the middle of his translation in the city of Tokat, Turkey, Martyn died this month in history on October 16th, 1812, at the age of 31. Though his life was short, the impact that Martyn had through his translations of the scripture made it an eternal impact. He once said, "Now let me burn out for God." But he probably had little idea how fast it would happen. Martyn compressed a lifetime of service into just 6 years of mission work. Seeing a need is one thing, but meeting a need is even better. You see, sometimes a problem can open up a whole world of possibilities. That's what Emma Whitmore learned. In the late 1800s, she was a society woman in New York City with wealth and connections that anyone would envy. But she would come to scorn her wealth for the sake of the needy. She saw that the young women working on the streets needed homes to get out of their dire circumstances. On October 25th, this month in history in 1890, she opened the first door of hope. By the end of her life, there would be 97 homes operating in 7 different countries.
Emma Whitmore and her husband Sidney were not brooding philanthropists looking for ways to spend their fortune on errands of mercy. They were actually quite content in their life of luxury. Busy with parties and balls, they would use their fortune to pay the wages of many servants and caterers of their extravagant events. A friend of the Whitmores convinced her to attend a meeting led by an evangelist at the local YMCA. Coincidentally, Sidney, her husband, also attended the meeting. Neither of them knew the other was in attendance. During the meeting, they were both deeply convicted about how they had neglected the pain and suffering that was abundant in the world. Individually, they each committed their lives to change right then and there.
Emma's friend asked her to attend another meeting. This one was led by ex-convict Jerry McCauley. Jerry was known as a notorious river thief. Charged with highway robbery at the age of 18, McCauley was sent to the infamous correctional center Sing Sing. In prison, the young man encountered Jesus, and his life began to change. He was pardoned and released by the age of 26. When he returned to a life of freedom, McCauley founded the first rescue mission to support the underprivileged of New York City. Jerry McCauley's incredible story drew Emma and Sidney Whitmore to one of these meetings. What they encountered changed their lives.
Never can that night be erased from my memory. From the time we got off the car at Roosevelt Street, each step opened up some new horror. There was cursing, fighting, police violence, and folks dragged off to jail. The smell was unbearable, and the speaker's manner was more rough around the edges than they were used to. We both reviled the poor creatures that filled the dance hall that evening. As the meeting progressed, however, God got such possession of Sidney, and later of myself also, that we were both held in painful silence as we were convicted of our useless lives. We no longer felt superior to the poor creatures, but actually hung our heads in shame.
As McCauley preached the word, the meeting eventually transitioned to personal testimonies. One by one, people in McCauley's rescue mission would come up to the front, praising the Lord that they were kept from their sins, despite their daily temptations. Emma and Sidney saw signs of genuine transformation. As Emma's journal entry tells us,
these people were truly transformed and possessed the genuine thing and not the veneer that characterized some professed Christians in the social circle that had engrossed our time and thought.
Overcome with emotion, Sidney Whitmore requested prayer as he hid his face in his hands, weeping. Emma notes that he was such a, quote, stiff Presbyterian that even she was surprised at his display of emotion. That night, she journaled.
I thought he had never appeared nobler or braver in my eyes. I could not let him stand alone. Where he would go, I would go.
At the meeting, Emma stood by her husband in support. As they knelt at the altar, the wealthy couple was encircled by an unlikely cluster of saints.
There was a drunkard, a thief, and a tramp on my husband's side, and on my side, one or two poor women. We arose with a holy determination born of God himself to henceforth live for his glory and praise. From that night, I date the giving up of a worldly life.
Eager to see the souls won to Christ, Emma and Sydney could frequently be found at Jerry McCauley's mission, the very place they said they would visit only once.
For Emma, that night at McCauley's mission was the first step in her transformation. She committed her life to making a difference in the lives of others. But looking back, we can see God was steering her toward the mission long before she and her husband attended that meeting.
12 years before, Emma Whitmore had suffered a fall and fractured one of her lower vertebrae. She had constant discomfort and frequent severe pain that rendered her bedridden. The stairs were out of the question, and oftentimes her husband had to carry her. The condition progressed so severely that she had moments when death seemed more desirable than life. After years of suffering, a healing minister by the name of A.B. Simpson caught her attention. He was the founder of the notable Christian Missionary Alliance, and Emma was just curious enough to attend. Skeptical, Emma walked out of the first healing meeting. Her own pastor tried to persuade her from getting her hopes up, but in spite of her doubts, she found herself attending more meetings at Simpson's church. She wondered, could God heal her? In order to settle the matter once and for all, Emma withdrew from the noisy world. For 4 days, she shut herself away with her Bible. On the 4th day, she asked God for healing, and then she waited. She wrote in her journal, "He enabled me to claim healing upon the authority of his word."
A voice of encouragement came from her own little boy, who assured his mother that God would indeed heal her. So she got out of bed with faith and determination. The following evening, as she was getting ready for bed, she bent into a position that would usually cause her agony. This time, she only felt a bruising sensation. She knew she had been healed. One night soon after, Emma was spending time alone with God. In an earnest moment, she asked the Lord, what should she do with her healing? Here's what happened in her own words.
Suddenly, the girls on the street came to my mind so forcibly that it was not difficult to almost imagine I could hear the tramp of numberless feet going straight to damnation.
But the mere thought of working with those women brought terror to her soul. Oh, anything but that, she pleaded. But after a moment of profound silence, she realized in her heart she was severely lacking in love. She knew that if she disobeyed, she would lose an amazing opportunity to experience the presence of God. So she agreed to the task, thrusting herself into mission work.
The horrors we witnessed nearly overpowered us. Often after such nights of tramping the streets, I have dropped upon my knees as I reached home and in tears cried out, "Oh Lord, I cannot see these fearful sights again. It simply breaks my heart."
Emma's obedience led to the founding of the Door of Hope Mission House on October 25th, this month in history, in 1890. After 4 years, the mission had helped over 300 young women. Emma's main concern was to introduce them to Christ, then help meet their material needs, and finally, instruct them on how to introduce others to the gospel. Emma recalls a conversation she had with a 15-year-old girl with a new baby and no home.
After a brief conversation, I informed her that we had not thought of taking children. Before I could explain any further, big tears flowed down her face as she said, "Oh, I'd rather walk the streets and starve with my baby in my arms than to have a place to stay and give him up. Every place I've been refuses to take me because I have a baby, but I just won't give him up. I love him too much to let him go." I concluded it was no time for talking, so I simply replied, "Well, dear, let us kneel together and ask what the Lord wants us to do." With my arm around the trembling shoulders, I could somehow better appreciate the depths of the motherly love that was in her heart, even though she was only a child herself. I offered fervent prayer on her behalf, and before arising from our knees, the matter was settled. I pressed a kiss on her cheek as I said, "Hannah, dear child, I'll take you both. You may bring your baby."
Emma Whitmore submitted her life and her plans to God's will and allowed Him to shape the mission of her life. Even when she was already reaching out, the Lord prompted her to reach a little further. Women, children, anyone who needed a little hope. Emma Whitmore never stopped reaching, until eventually she was reaching across the globe. By the time of Emma's death in 1931, 97 Door of Hope locations had been established all around the world. The Great Commission begins wherever you are. Then it reaches to the ends of the earth. Some see a missionary's life as one of sacrifice. But one of my favorite missionaries, Jim Elliot, had a different perspective. He wrote, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain which he cannot lose." I'm reminded of the passage in Luke 24 that says, "If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it." Jim Elliot and his companions took those words with them when they traveled to take the gospel to the Huaorani tribespeople in the rainforests of Ecuador.
Between the Napo and Curare rivers in Ecuador, an area of about 7,000 square miles made the tribal area of the Huaorani. There were about 600 people total, making 3 smaller groups within the greater tribe. All 3 groups were equally hostile. The Gikataiti, the Baidi, and Waipaidi. The tribes were generally hunter-gatherers, and their weapons of choice were spears and blowguns. The Huaorani violently defended their territory, and any outsiders were deeply distrusted. It was generally believed that most outsiders were cannibal predators. They had already killed several Shell Oil employees in the 1940s, as well as many outsiders that trespassed on their lands. The violence was not only limited to outsiders, as they would have many intertribal skirmishes. Revenge killings were frequent, as well as raids on houses fueled by intense anger.
Jim Elliot first heard about the Huaorani in 1950 from another Ecuadorian missionary and quickly realized it was his calling to lead an outreach to the tribespeople. Elliot met up with Pete Fleming to take on this mission.
Fleming and Elliot traded notes on the potential ministry opportunities in Ecuador, and by 1952 were sailing for Guayaquil on mission with the Plymouth Brethren. For 6 months, they lived in Quito and learned Spanish. Then they moved on to a mission station deep in the jungles of Ecuador. They studied the culture and language of the locals. Elliot and Fleming would need more help to reach the tribe. In one journal entry, Elliot recorded his prayer for a team. "I have prayed for new men, fiery, reckless men, possessed of uncontrollably youthful passion, lit by the Spirit of God. I have prayed for new words, explosive, direct, simple words. I have prayed for new miracles. Lord, fill preachers and preaching with thy power. How long dare we go on without tears, without moral passions, hatred, and love? Not long, I pray, Lord Jesus, not long." Elliot's prayers were answered when Ed Macaulay and Nate Saint joined the team. Elliot met Macaulay while attending Wheaton College. Nate Saint, the team's pilot, served in the military during the Second World War and was trained to fly by the Army. Saint had already been shuttling supplies into other missionaries in the jungle. Also joining the team was Roger Udarian, who was already stationed in Ecuador for missions work. He worked with Nate Saint to provide important medical supplies. The first stage of Operation Aka was to locate the Huaorani by air. In September 1955, Saint, Macaulay, Elliot, and missionary Johnny Keegan began periodic searches using the mission's plane. Locating a few clearings in the jungle, the team began to get hopeful. They found a sandbar in the middle of the Curare River that worked as a landing strip for the plane, and it was there that they first made contact with the Huaorani. They were elated to be able to finally be able to attempt to share the love of Christ with this people group. They hoped that by regularly giving gifts to the Huaorani and attempting to communicate with them in their language, that they would be able to win them over as friends.
On October 6th, this month in history in 1955, they made the first contact with the tribes by dropping a package containing a kettle, buttons, and rock salt. The gift-giving continued during the following weeks, with the missionaries dropping machetes, ribbons, clothing, pots, and various trinkets. Jim Elliot and his group began making frequent flights over the land of the Huaorani in September 1955, dropping gifts from a plane. They eventually established a base camp along the sandbar on the Kuare River.
It was difficult and risky to meet the dangerous Huaorani on the surface, so the team used their fixed-wing aircraft to drop gifts down on them from above. Nate Saint developed their drop technique, which involved flying tight circles around the drop zone while simultaneously lowering the package to the ground. He was able to do this in a vortex motion that had the effect of keeping the package perfectly center while in descent.
After several visits to the landing zone nicknamed Terminal City, they observed that the Huaorani seemed positive about receiving their gifts. So they decided to initiate verbal contact over the loudspeaker, shouting simple Huaorani phrases while encircling over their heads. Several drops later, the Huaorani began to tie gifts of their own for the missionaries as a gesture of thanks. They then developed plans to meet in person.
As the mission continued, Elliot would continue to journal about the team's plans and how God was always in control. He wrote, "The will of God is always a bigger thing than we bargain for. But we must believe that whatever it involves, it is good, acceptable, and perfect. I seek not a long life, but a full one, like you, Lord Jesus." On January 3rd, they successfully landed on Palm Beach and set up base camp. After the last delivery of supplies, he flew over a Huaorani settlement and, using a loudspeaker, invited the Huaorani to come visit the missionaries' camp. After the missionaries had spent several days of waiting around and shouting general Huaorani phrases into the jungle, the first Huaorani visitors arrived on January 6th. It was a young man and 2 women. The younger woman had come disobediently against the warning of her family. The man, Nankiwi, was romantically interested in her, so he followed. The older woman went along to ensure she was safe. The missionaries gave them many gifts, and after a time, the tribal people soon relaxed around the strange Americans. Nankiwi, whom the missionaries nicknamed George, was very interested in their aircraft, so Saint gave him a ride. They flew all around the jungle, and even by Nankiwi's neighbors, where he leaned out of the plane waving and shouting at them. The plane stunt by Nankiwi was too much to ignore, and a group of Huaorani decided to make the trip to Palm Beach the next morning, January 7th. On the way there, they found Nankiwi and the girl without their escort. A senior member of the group, who had considerable experience with outsiders, gave his advice on how to handle the situation. He recommended they kill the foreigners. The older woman eventually returned and gave her account of the strangers' friendliness, but this was not enough to dissuade them, and they kept marching toward the Palm Beach.
On January 8th, after a few recon trips, the pilot Nate Saint located a group of Huaorani men headed toward Palm Beach and enthusiastically relayed the info to his wife over radio.
The Huaorani sent 3 women to the other side of the river as an attempt to divide the Americans before attacking. One tribesman, Dawa, stayed behind, hiding in the jungle brush. The other 2 revealed themselves, and 2 missionaries waded into the water to say hello. They were immediately attacked from behind by the girl's brother, Nampa. Elliot was the first missionary to be speared. The other missionary in the river, Fleming, before being speared, desperately reiterated friendly sayings and asked the Huaorani why they were killing them. While he pleaded for his life, the other 3 missionaries were being surrounded and speared by the other band of Huaorani warriors. Udarian rushed to the plane to use the radio, but he was speared as soon as he picked up the microphone. The Huaorani threw their bodies and their things into the river and tore the fabric from the aircraft. After returning to their village, they curiously burned it down, apparently expecting a revenge attack and wanting to fool them into thinking an attack had already been placed.
The men failing to communicate with their wives at the scheduled time caused them to worry, but the women kept it under wraps due to the secretive nature of the mission. A fellow missionary flew to the campsite to check on them and found the plane stripped of its fabric. He told the wives of the situation and that the men were not there.
The United States Air Rescue mobilized an aircraft, and in coordination with ground search, the first 2 bodies were found on Wednesday, January 11th. By the next day, all the bodies had been identified with the exception of Macaulay's. The locals returned his watch, claiming they found his body on the bank, but it had washed away. The identified bodies were buried in the same grave at Palm Beach on January 14th by the ground search party.
The deaths of the men were covered in Life magazine, including photographs taken just before their deaths. The worldwide publicity that followed gave much more visibility to mission organizations and access to resources. Jim Elliot's wife, Elizabeth Elliot, and one of the sisters, Rachel Saint, believed the men's sacrifice for the Huaorani people was similar to Christ's sacrifice for humanity. They both doubled down on their family's commitment to the people by remaining in Ecuador and working alongside the Huaorani tribe.
Leading several cross-tribe weddings, they were successful in ending the intertribal warfare among the groups and largely eliminated the rampant violence that plagued the people for so long. During his life, Jim Elliot longed for more people to become missionaries. In his death, however, he probably inspired more people to go to other countries to share the love of Jesus than he ever could have in his life. The resounding theme of October's Missions Month is the boundless love of Jesus in fulfilling the Great Commission. All of these missionaries gave their life for the gospel. Their stories will continue to echo throughout history.
During his life, Jim Elliot longed for more people to become missionaries. In his death, however, he probably inspired more people to go to other countries to share the love of Jesus than he ever could have in life. The resounding theme of October's Mission Month is the boundless love of Jesus in fulfilling the Great Commission. All of these missionaries gave their life for the gospel. Their stories will continue to echo throughout history. I hope you've enjoyed looking back at what happened this month in Christian history. What I love about studying the past is that one moment in time can open up loads of incredible history. No matter how much life we've lived, we can all learn so much from the believers that have gone before us. The peaks and valleys that they endured can prepare us to pioneer our own paths. But most of all, they can inspire us to trust in the God who holds all of history in his hands. I'm Cody Crouch. I hope you'll join me next time on This Month in Christian History. Until then, go make some history of your own.